What words come to mind when you hear the phrase social work?
Just the school social workers, really.
For me, it would be like helping people.
Helping people with I'm not I'm not sure really.
Resources, helping, supporting.
I think of people who come to the aid of those who are in crisis or who help de-escalate certain situations.
I'm a teacher, so I usually think of like the school social worker and like social support, social emotional, mental support, even things like educational and job opportunity support.
Someone who is licensed to help individuals, families, groups, come to be able to cope with like everyday life issues. And then when I think of licensed clinical social workers, I think of therapy.
Social support, social determinants of health, supporting others beyond health, adjustment to their daily lives, and like living daily in a good way.
I especially was surprised at how many people actually knew what a social worker was.
Yeah.
Because I know before I came to college, I didn't know what a social work was, and I didn't even know that I had come in contact with people who were social workers.
Yeah, people were pretty spot on. They mentioned a lot of words that I probably would have brought up as well.
I think the main one I think we heard in all the responses was some form of support or help. Mm-hmm. That came up in almost every single person.
Maybe the reason why we had these like accurate responses is just the location of being near a college campus. So I think if you like ask this question to a different population, you could get very drastically different answers. But around here, they
knew what social work was, and they were ready to tell us.
Really on top of it, yeah.
Why do you think a person might go to see a social worker?
There's a pretty broad range of services from like medical care to job care to housing, sort of all of those social safety nets, whether they still exist or not is a whole nother question, but like services for those social safety nets.
It's involuntary. It's in the hospital when they don't have a home or their home is too dangerous for them to go to. But it's extreme need.
I think someone would see a social worker maybe in situations involving minors or relapse of drugs, or just any type of crisis in which there is someone endangered. Someone might see a social worker if they need help.
Yeah, they kind of covered.
They covered a lot of really good reasons to see social workers. I think it's really important what Lachelle said, which is the extreme cases when they don't have a home or their home is too dangerous to go and the extreme need. That's not the only time that you see social workers. In fact, you probably have seen one just on your day-to-day.
Yeah, it was interesting to have the two. So Chris was like very broad and covered, I think, a lot of the variety, talking about like there are medical, like hospital care social workers. They do, like, social workers help find jobs and housing.
And just general access to services. Even when it's not extreme need, but you're just like, how do I get in touch with this service? Or what does it look like for me to do this? You're probably reaching out to a social worker.
One other thing that I would say that didn't come up, I can think of at least one thing that didn't come up that I would want to mention, which is macro level
yes,
social workers, which is not necessarily something that you think, oh, people go to see these social workers, but like social workers work on policy and they work on there's big change. You probably know more about this than I do.
Well, there's a lot of hidden places that there are social workers that you wouldn't consider. So kind of like what I was just talking about with you with the access to services. When you're on a website for like an organization, that was probably put together by a macro or intern social worker. That is someone who made that, and they had to think about the client and the client's needs, and so that was likely put together by a social worker. But also like grant writing, all of that can be done by anyone in a company and organization, but social workers are, especially in macro level social work, are really good at that because they can really think about what's needed for the organization and how it's going to benefit the client directly, and how you can quantitatively see that, and that's the sort of thing that you would see written in a grant.
Who do you think social workers work with?
They work with a variety of people, like children, adults, in different places like schools or hospitals, or in the community.
I'd say a different variety of people, personnel who need help with certain matters, other personnel looking for help in regards to resources, jobs. I'd say a great plethora of different personnel.
People probably who are in like a minority of some sort are probably the most commonly worked with people, because those are the people that need assistance in accessing social services, I think, most of the time.
Everyone.
Yeah.
That's the short answer.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. I mean, that's all I have to say. But like they said, specifically people go to social workers to get help with things, which has been a pretty consistent response from.
It's the overarching response.
And that's pretty accurate, I think.
Yeah. I have a phrase that I like to use with most people, which is everyone needs counseling at some point. I think the same thing applies with social work. You're going to need some sort of help, whether it be getting access to some form of care or just generally needing someone to talk to.
I think like you said, talking is a big thing on its own, just having someone to talk to for people who lack support systems or have things that they don't want to talk about with people that are close to them. That's kind of on one side, I guess, of a spectrum of reasons that people might go. So bigger things would be housing and some of the resource things that we've mentioned before, jobs.
Also coming out of hospitals, if you've had a bad fall or something like that, the person you're going to talk to before discharge, that's a social worker who's helping you figure out what your plan is from then on. What level of education do you think social workers have?
I mean, you can have any kind of, most of them have bachelors, but you can have masters and doctorates.
I was glad we asked this because when I was considering going into social work, I had literally no idea.
I will admit, when I found out social work was a field, I actually looked it up immediately to see all the different paths, and pretty much the entire field is open to you when you have a BSW. You're just not paid very much. It's hard to get jobs as easily because you're going up against other MSWs. But yeah, so there's BSWs, which get you in a lot of caseworking jobs, I would say. That's the main thing you can easily find with a BSW. And so there are a lot of different types of caseworking jobs. There's short-term casework. So for an example, I did a crisis job, and then crisis intervention, that's not necessarily called casework, but it's seeing clients, and then you have to check up on them in some cases, especially if they're children. And so you have a small caseload that you check up on. And there's also follow-up calls, and so that's still considered casework because you have a specified amount of clients that you have to check in on. But then longer term casework, I used to work with Intact Family Services, which is working with DCFS in helping kids stay united with their families. That's the main part of that job. And so I had 15 families that I would check in every single week and go to their house, physically drive to their house, check on their house and make sure it was safe, get them access to the resources they needed, do my own research to figure out what resources were available. So there's a lot of different things you can see that with crisis intervention versus going to someone's house and giving them resources, like those look very different. But those are both considered some form of casework, although one's more on the crisis side.
But those are positions that can be filled by
BSWs. Yeah. But then there's like all sorts of other things that can be filled by BSWs, including hospital social workers can be a BSW. I would say most of the time you find them filled by MSWs because they're seen as needing a higher level of care and needing more of a gentle hand. MSWs, though, no, that should be, you should talk about MSWs. I've talked so much, and you know about MSWs.
So I think for me, the essential thing is to officially be a social worker, you have to have one of these two degrees. And like Percy said, a lot of these positions can and are frequently covered by people with bachelor's degrees. MSW positions enable you to work out in private practice and in some more like specialized areas.
Yeah, so MSWs can also be supervisors. So for every BSW, there pretty much has to be a supervisor that is an MSW, and oftentimes they have to be licensed as well. And there are different forms of licensure depending on what part of the field you're in, but the main licensures that are pretty important for our field would be an LSW and an LCSW.
So licensed social worker and licensed clinical social worker, which I don't think we need to get into the specifics of that. But essentially, when it comes to level of education, you need your bachelor's in social work or your master's in social work or both. And certain positions are limited to master level degrees. In addition to that, you probably there are positions that require licensure as a form of like.
Now, whether or not organizations actually stick with what the requirements are is a whole nother can of worms. Some positions are supposed to be only MSW. In fact, any position that you do any form of counseling is supposed to be only MSW. But oftentimes you see organizations getting BSWs instead because you can pay them less. Even though they're less trained and they shouldn't be in those roles.
Probably some of that and also some of the need requirements as well. There's just going to be less MSWs, I'm assuming.
No, that's a fair point too. It also is worth mentioning, besides BSW and MSW, you can also get a PhD in social work. And oftentimes that's where you see more macro level social workers, where they've gotten a PhD in some form of research, or more specific to policy.
In your own words, what do you think social workers do?
Yes, my girlfriend actually is a master's in social work program, so I have a little idea, yes. She's going to become a therapist, but social worker is a very broad term. It's really just helping people.
Oh my gosh, and I work with one. Ain't that terrible?
You're fine.
Well, they help out with the community. I know the one lady I work with, she helps out with the community. She's more into the elderly, so making sure they get their needs and stuff like that. And
What does the person you work with do?
She's a social worker / she also owns a daycare for the adult daycare center. So she does a lot of community, like the Alzheimer's walk. She runs that. She does make things where they can sell their little projects that the elderly do. She has a lot of interns that come into the building to help them with their social working skills, as far as filing and knowing how to cope with people.
I would say social workers work with folks the public who need help with therapy.
This is like
everything we've already said.
This is
Well, I did like how Michael, he was mentioning that his girlfriend wants to be a therapist, but he almost felt the need to explain to us that social workers and therapists were different in the way he said it. He was very much like, oh, but she wants to be a therapist, which I thought that was super interesting because therapists are still social workers. They're just providing therapy.
Yeah, and I couldn't tell. I felt like he was saying that to emphasize that therapy is not the only aspect of social work. Like, it's a thing that we do sometimes.
I think that's a good point. It often people talk about social workers without thinking of them as social workers, but more what job they're in. So like, oh, this is my caseworker. Oh, you know, they work with the elderly to get their needs met. But like, it's not thinking about them as a social worker. Like, oh yeah, this person's a social worker, and right now, and their main population is working with the elderly. So
No, that's a good point though, and I think it kind of goes back to why we wanted to start this channel of like, I think people,
they don't really understand that like you and I are going to be social workers no matter what we're doing, where in the field we are. You know, one day I could be working with children, and then the next day I could get a new job and work, you know, with the homeless population, and I'm still a social worker. I'm doing something entirely different, but I'm still a social worker. And I think it can be confusing because it's closer to a term like doctors, but it's not seen like that.
I almost never hear people say, oh, I went to see my social worker today. I think part of it is like how vague social work is, like what?
I think that is part of it, is that it's so huge. But I think the other part, at least to me, is, I don't know, when I hear like, oh yeah, I went to see my social worker, there's almost that like stigma around it.
I agree.
Versus like, I went to see my therapist. There's less stigma around going to therapy at this point, but seeing your social worker, that's almost seen as like you did something wrong. It's stigmatized.
I also wonder if people like who are going to therapy, if they know whether or not their therapists have degrees in social work. And that might be something that we talk about later too, is like the difference between social workers and other mental health professionals, because I think that's...
I didn't know that until the end of my BSW. And that sounds awful, but I really didn't.
I struggled a lot to figure that out, yeah.
Because no one explicitly said it either.
And there's a lot of overlap. I don't want this to seem like we're like, oh, social work is a totally different thing.
Especially because like some people get their bachelor's in psychology and then go, actually, I want to be a social worker, and then they get an MSW in social work.
That's me.
Or the opposite.
Why are you talking about me?
The opposite also happens though. Like there will be people who are like, BSW, yeah, and then they're like, actually, no, this is not what I want. I want to be paid more.
Yeah. And that was a decision that I had to make and like figure out after I had done psychology. And it was really hard to figure it out. I talked to like 3 actual social workers, which for me is a lot of people to be talking to.
You're very quiet.
It was one of those things I mentioned earlier that like Google searches were only helpful to a certain degree.
Yeah.
How is social work different from psychology, from mental health in general, there were a couple of, therapy was one that I was like, how does therapy fit into all of this?
Especially because there's a bazillion different words. Therapy, counselor,
counseling with
psychiatry, psychological, social
psychoanalysts, like all of this stuff that there are all these words
and
that are
societal sometimes, community-based, individual based, like there's literally 1,000 terms.
And even, I will say, even people in the field don't know. Yeah. Like the people, when I said I talked to 3 different people, it's sure because the first 2 were not sure. And even I think the third was like, this is how I understand it, but like, get different perspectives because it is
there's no
multifaceted, right?
Term.
Do you think social workers are important to our society?
Of course, they serve so many facets. Social workers are jacks of all trades.
Social workers are super important to our society, as well as community health workers and psychologists. I think all of them do a very good work helping people thrive and like succeed and, I don't know, develop in a healthy, I would say, manner.
All right, we answered quite a few questions about social work. Now we have the most important question of all. Which pet should be our mascot?
Put your vote in the comments below if you should have thoughts on it. We'll do a little outro with videos from each pet. They're like audition films for the position.
It's a very important position to be filled, so make sure you take this seriously.
Yeah. And then also feel free to include any questions that you have for us or anything that you'd like to see discussed in future videos. It's kind of up for grabs at this point.
Yeah.
So,
and we had a nice first video.
That's all we got.
That's all we got.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Hazel. Hazel.